The Mongol Empire wasn't just built by warriors on horseback. It was built by millions of enslaved people whose names we'll never know. People who were captured, chained, and forced to serve the greatest land empire in history. Today, we're going to dive into what daily life was actually like for these forgotten souls. Welcome to Mongol Madness. Tell me you love me. In 1221, the Mongol armies took the city of Merv in present-day Turkmenistan. When the killing stopped, the Persian historian Juvaini tells us what happened next. The survivors were sorted like livestock, skilled from unskilled, young from old, beautiful from plain. Those deemed useful were chained in long lines and began the brutal march eastward into slavery. Here's the part that should make your stomach turn. Juvaini recorded that captives were divided among the Mongol soldiers, with each warrior receiving between 300 and 400 slaves, depending on their rank. 300 human beings, handed to a single soldier, like sacks of grain. Most wouldn't survive the journey. Juvaini wrote that the roads were lined with corpses of those who collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. And if you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the Chinese scholar Zhao Hong had to say about the conquest of northern China in the 1220s. He estimated that only about half of those initially captured survived the forced marches to Mongol territory. The weak killed where they fell. The Mongols couldn't afford to slow down, but it gets worse. The Persian chronicler Juvaini provided even more disturbing details. Pregnant women and the elderly were separated out and killed immediately after a city's fall. Children too young to work? Often killed as well. The Mongols were ruthlessly practical. They only wanted slaves who could provide immediate value. If you couldn't work, you were already dead. Rise and grind. For those who survived, life began before the sun rose. According to the secret history of the Mongols, slaves were called bo'ol, or ötegu bo'ol, those who served. They slept in the same felt yurts as their masters' households, crammed together under piles of sheepskins against the brutal Mongolian cold. And when I say the first task was always the same, I mean always. Milking the mares. Now you might be thinking, how bad could that be? Let me tell you. This was crucial work because mare's milk was fermented into arag, the alcoholic drink central to Mongol culture. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar who traveled through the empire in the 1250s, described how slaves, particularly female slaves, had to milk the horses 5 to 6 times throughout the day. 5 to 6 times. Every single day. And here's the thing. Mongol horses were small, tough, and mean-tempered. The constant milking in freezing conditions left slaves' hands cracked and bleeding. William noted that the smell of fermented milk permeated everything, and those who worked with it carried the odor permanently on their skin. Imagine never being able to wash that smell away. Ever. A household of mid-ranking nobility might keep 20 or more mares. Each one needed milking multiple times daily. And that was just the morning. After came an endless succession of other tasks. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who visited Mongol domains in the 1330s, described how male slaves spent their days tending herds, repairing equipment, and performing whatever manual labor their masters required. Female slaves had it even worse. Hours grinding grain by hand, preparing meals, cleaning yurts, tending fires, watching the master's children. And William of Rubruck observed that slave women also had to pack and unpack entire households whenever the camp moved, which happened several times a year as the Mongols followed their herds. By evening, slaves might finally have a brief period of rest, but even this time wasn't truly their own. They ate whatever scraps were left from their master's meals, slept in whatever space was available, and prepared to wake before dawn and begin again. Day after day after day. Money, money, money. The Mongol Empire had standardized prices for human beings. Let that sink in for a moment. According to the Yasa, Genghis Khan's law code, an able-bodied male slave was worth roughly the same as a donkey. A female slave cost about the same as a cow. Children were cheaper still. In Karakoram, the Mongol capital, you could walk through rows of chained people just like browsing livestock at a market. Marco Polo described these scenes in the 1270s. He wrote that beautiful young women fetched the highest prices, purchased to become concubines or additional wives. Chinese and Persian craftsmen commanded premium prices too because of their skills. But here's something that'll really hit you. A Genoese notary named Lamberto di Sambuceto kept detailed records of slave sales in Famagusta, Cyprus, in the 1290s. His documents survive today, and they're absolutely chilling to read. Slave after slave listed by name, origin, age, and price. Let me read you just a few. Maria from Circassia, age 16, sold for 12 bezants. George from Georgia, age 20, sold for 14 bezants. Catherine, origin unknown, age 15, sold for 10 bezants. On and on and on, page after page. The clinical precision of it all somehow makes it worse. These were real people with real names, reduced to ledger entries. And you can be sure that for every name we have in Lamberto's records, there are hundreds more whose names are lost forever. The Venetian merchant Josephat Barbaro, traveling through the Black Sea region in the 15th century, described slave markets where thousands of people were sold weekly. Thousands, every single week. The trade was so extensive, it had become one of the primary economic activities of the entire region. Ships constantly moved between Crimean ports and Mediterranean markets, their holds packed with enslaved people like cargo. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because the scale is staggering. When the Mongols conquered the Khwarezmian Empire in the 1220s, they enslaved hundreds of thousands. The conquest of the Jin dynasty in China likely produced over 1 million slaves. The campaigns in Russia and Eastern Europe added hundreds of thousands more. Marco Polo estimated that during his time in the empire, there were millions of slaves across Mongol territories. Millions. And modern historians generally agree with him. Against all odds, here's something that might surprise you. Unlike the later transatlantic slave trade, slavery in the Mongol Empire wasn't strictly hereditary. Some slaves could actually purchase their freedom if they somehow accumulated enough wealth. And occasionally, against all odds, some actually managed it. The Russian Primary Chronicle tells us about Russian captives who converted to the Mongol religion and served so loyally that they were eventually granted their freedom. Some even received positions of minor authority. The empire was pragmatic like that. Loyalty and usefulness mattered more than birth or ethnicity. But the most extraordinary story comes from the secret history itself. Remember, I mentioned a slave boy named Yelme. Here's his story. Yelme was born into slavery, but he showed exceptional loyalty to the young Temujin, who would later become Genghis Khan. During one battle, when Temujin was wounded by an arrow, Yelme stayed by his side through the night, sucking the blood from his wounds to keep him alive. Temujin never forgot this. When he became Genghis Khan, he freed Yelme and made him one of his most trusted generals. Yelme went on to command armies and became one of the most powerful men in the empire, from slave to general. It's an incredible story, but let's be honest, for every Yelme who got impossibly lucky, there were thousands upon thousands who died in chains, their names forgotten, breaking free or dying. And some slaves decided they'd rather die trying to escape than continue living in bondage. In 1238, according to Russian chronicles, a group of enslaved Russians attempted to flee from their Mongol captors near the Volga River. They planned their escape carefully waiting for a night when their guards were distracted. They almost made it, but they were hunted down. All but a handful were killed. The survivors? Mutilated as a warning to others. You can imagine what that warning looked like. Needless to say, escape attempts dropped sharply after that. More common was passive resistance, working slowly, feigning illness, deliberately breaking tools. These small acts of defiance were dangerous, but they were also assertions of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Ibn Battuta mentioned encountering escaped slaves during his travels, men and women who had fled into remote areas and lived as outlaws rather than continue in bondage. The Mongols were relentless in hunting these escapees. The punishment for being caught was usually death, but sometimes slaves fought back in more dramatic ways. Juvaini recorded an incident where a Persian slave managed to poison his master's entire family before fleeing into the night. The man was never caught, and he became something of a legend among other slaves. But the cost was terrible. In retaliation, all the other Persian slaves in the camp were executed. Every single one of them. This kind of collective punishment was common and served to make slaves police each other's behavior, because if one person rebelled, everyone else paid the price. Stolen childhood. The fate of children in the Mongol slave system is particularly heartbreaking. The secret history mentions that slave children were often raised alongside the master's children, though always as subordinates. They played together as children, but they would never be equals. Peng Dia, a Chinese historian who visited Mongolia in 1233, observed that children of slaves were sometimes trained in useful skills, particularly boys. A slave child who showed aptitude for metalwork, carpentry, or other crafts might be apprenticed and eventually become valuable. Girls faced more limited prospects, and we'll get to what that meant in a moment. The Franciscan missionary John of Montecorvino, working in China in the early 1300s, wrote letters back to Rome about his work. In one letter from 1305, he described purchasing slave children in the markets to free them and raise them as Christians. He wrote that he had freed and baptized over 150 children this way, teaching them Latin and training them to sing in his church choir. John's account, while serving his own religious purposes, reveals something important. There were so many enslaved children that a single missionary could purchase 150 of them. Think about how many thousands more there must have been across the vast empire. But here's something that tells you everything you need to know about the system. John of Plano Carpini, a papal envoy who visited the Mongol court in 1246, observed that many slaves in Mongol camps were of mixed heritage. Their features showed both their mother's original ethnicity and their Mongol father's bloodline. These children were born from rape, and they were themselves usually enslaved, inheriting their mother's status. Think about that for a moment. Born into slavery because your mother was raped. That was the reality for countless children. Suffer the women. The historical record is absolutely clear and heartbreaking on this point. The Yasa gave masters absolute authority over their slaves, and that included sexual access. There's no way to sugarcoat this. Juvaini wrote explicitly about how Mongol warriors would take the wives and daughters of defeated enemies as slaves, using them however they wished. Peng Dia noted that female slaves had no recourse against their owners' sexual demands. Resistance could mean death. He described seeing women who had been captured from Jin dynasty territories being openly abused by their captors. The Chinese scholar Zhao Hong described how Mongol warriors would take the wives and daughters of defeated enemies as slaves. Some became additional wives or concubines if they were deemed attractive enough. Those who weren't faced an even grimmer fate as common slaves available to whoever wanted them. Ibn Battuta observed that wealthy Mongol households might have dozens of female slaves performing domestic duties, but he noted with obvious discomfort that these women were subject to their masters' whims in every way. William of Rubruck made similar observations, though he was often more careful in his language. This wasn't occasional abuse. It was a fundamental feature of the slave system. Women captured in raids were frequently distributed as concubines. The sources are filled with accounts of women torn from their families and subjected to systematic sexual violence. These weren't footnotes in the historical record. They were everyday realities for countless enslaved women. Women with names and families and lives that were violently stolen from them. The shadow of empire. These people came from everywhere the Mongols conquered. Chinese and Koreans, Persians and Arabs, Russians and Hungarians, Turks and Armenians and Georgians. They were farmers and scholars, merchants and craftsmen, mothers and fathers and children. They had lives and dreams before the Mongols came. And then, in the space of a day or a week, everything they knew was destroyed. The sources record the conquerors, but rarely the conquered. We know the names of Mongol khans and generals, but the names of their slaves are mostly lost. We know where the armies marched and which cities fell, but we rarely hear the voices of those who were chained and marched away. When we study the Mongol Empire, we're often dazzled by its unprecedented achievement. The largest contiguous land empire in history, sophisticated administration, religious tolerance, the Pax Mongolica that facilitated trade across Asia and connected East and West like never before. All of this is true and worth studying. But we must also remember that this empire was built on a foundation of extraordinary human suffering. The millions of enslaved people weren't footnotes to the Mongol story. They were essential to it. Their labor fed the armies, equipped the cavalry, maintained the infrastructure, and made the empire possible. And here's something that should give us pause. The Mongol slave system helped establish the infrastructure and normalize the trade routes that would later facilitate even larger systems of slavery. The markets in Crimea and the Black Sea that the Mongols helped expand would continue to operate for centuries, eventually feeding into the Ottoman slave trade and influencing patterns of human trafficking that persisted well into the modern era. The empire eventually fragmented in the 14th century, and the centralized slave system declined with it. Some slaves were freed, others were absorbed into the populations of the successor states. Many simply died in bondage, their stories unrecorded. But their legacy matters. Understanding the daily reality of slavery in the Mongol Empire helps us see that this institution wasn't just an abstract historical fact. It was a lived horror for real people. People who loved and hoped and suffered. People who weren't that different from us. They woke before dawn in the bitter cold. They worked until their bodies ached. They endured abuse and exploitation. They watched their children grow up in chains. They remembered homes they would never see again. And through it all, they survived as best they could, maintaining their humanity in a system designed to deny it. Their lives mattered, and their stories deserve to be told. Thanks for watching Mongol Madness. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe and share it. These stories need to be remembered. I'll see you next time.